It had been a pleasant encounter in Paris and a happy coincidence in Lyon, but here in Cannes it was, in fact, downright sinister. The meeting would change the course of his life, and in the long years that followed he occasionally allowed himself the indulgence of wondering what might have happened had he simply told the man to get lost there and then. Perhaps not in those terms, something more polite, as would be expected of a young English gentleman. He could have said he was terribly sorry, but he had no idea what he was talking about, and there'd clearly been a misunderstanding, and he really had to leave now. He'd have thanked him graciously for the drink and hurried off. He'd have disappeared, and probably left Cannes that night. But of course, he didn't. He'd spent enough time in the countryside to know a trapped animal only makes its predicament worse with futile attempts to extricate itself. He knew he'd little choice but to stay. And in those brief few moments when his instincts told him it would be foolish to leave, it was as if he somehow came to terms with the situation he found himself in. Not only was he reconciled to it, but he understood this was the hand he'd been dealt, and it would be best all round if he accepted that, made the most of it, and didn't waste time thinking about what might have been, however awful that may be. When he'd left London on the 1st of September, he couldn't have been in a more optimistic mood. Ahead lay 5 weeks of holiday before he was to start his first job. And not just any job. This was a prestigious one he'd achieved after a grueling series of interviews and examinations. Despite his family connections, he liked to think he'd got this job on merit. It was, as his father had solemnly pointed out when toasting him at dinner the previous evening, the start of his career, one which promised to be quite glorious. He was 22 and he no longer needed to worry about studies or exams, and it was a delightfully warm Tuesday morning and France was just hours away. His mother, of course, had worried about the journey. Such a long way to drive, and what he'd get up to in France. So long abroad. His ultimate destination was Cannes, where the family of a friend from university had a villa in the town's reassuringly named English Quarter. The MG Midget was his pride and joy, handsome in British racing green livery, and he was confident it would make the long journey to the south of France a pleasure. It only had a couple of 100 miles on the clock and was a bargain at £145, and the mechanic who checked it out at his father's garage said it was in excellent condition as long as he kept a good eye on the water and oil levels and didn't drive it for too long at its top speed of 65 miles per hour. He left his parents' house in Chelsea shortly after 6 and was in Dover in good time for the 10:30 crossing. It was early afternoon when they docked in Calais, and he couldn't decide whether to drive straight through to Paris, which he reckoned would be a good 4 hours, or to stop on the way, and then he realized he didn't need to decide yet. He could see how he felt, and he relished the sense of freedom this gave him. For the first time in his life, it was up to him to do what he wanted and when. In the end, he decided to stay overnight in Amiens, where he found a pleasant hotel close to the cathedral overlooking Parc de l'Evêché. He left Amiens early on the Wednesday morning after sending a high-spirited telegram to his parents assuring them their eldest son hadn't drowned in the channel or been abducted. Crossing fine, stop. En route Paris, stop. If kidnapped, pay ransom, stop. He spent the drive to Paris mildly regretting the telegram. His mother's reaction would be that he should grow up, especially now he had a career. He arrived in the French capital city early in the afternoon. He was staying at an apartment in the 8th arrondissement, belonging to a nephew of his godfather. The nephew worked at the Paris office of Barings Bank and was back in London for the week, but had been happy to lend him the keys to his apartment, which was located on Rue Montalivet, just round the corner from the British Embassy in Rue de Faubourg Saint-Honoré. He wasn't expected to be in Cannes before the weekend. He'd promised to be there for lunch on Sunday, and his plan was to stay 2 nights in Paris and then allow a further 2 days for the journey south.